Thank you, Anthony, for that wonderful introduction. And Shannon, thank you so much for agreeing to join me in this discussion about my book. It's an honor to have someone of your prestige lend that prestige to someone like me that's just starting out in the philosophical profession. So to get the ball rolling, what I thought I would do is ask a few very general questions about AI ethics. So this book is described as being about AI ethics, and indeed it's been reviewed by David Leslie, who's the ethics team lead at the Alan Turing Institute. So ostensibly it's a book about AI ethics, but as the title itself would suggest, a citizen's guide, it's drawing in more than just what we would consider to be questions of an ethical nature, because ethical questions generally pertain to the individual and how they confront moral dilemmas in their own lives. But as soon as you bring matters affecting the citizen into play, you're no longer just focusing on individual moral deliberation. Suddenly it's about the body politic. It's about everybody, and it's about how AI is affecting the body politic. So the first question I wanted to get your opinion about is about AI ethics as a discipline and how it connects to politics. So the way I'll ask this question to begin with is by referring to this meme that's going around. So there is this meme that basically considers that AI ethics really isn't a very interesting specialization at all, because the questions that pop up are just questions whose answers are uncontroversial. So there's this meme that says that the ethics of AI is no different from the ethics of a pencil. You shouldn't go around stabbing people with pencils. You shouldn't use lead pencils to write racist or sexist things. You shouldn't throw pencils at people. So it's like that. Don't be racist with AI technologies. Don't be sexist. Don't perpetuate discriminatory stereotypes using AI. Is there anything more to AI ethics than just this sort of bland vision?
Great. Well, first, I want to thank Anthony for inviting us to do this together, and thank you, John, for writing the book that gives us so many great themes to dig into and talk about. And to everybody who's on, I'm always amazed when anyone shows up for a Zoom call in April 2021 after a year now of living on Zoom and Teams and the like. Especially in the evening when I see 85 people willing to spend an evening with us. I'm so grateful, because I would not be surprised nor insulted if no one showed up, because everyone just said enough. But I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this. I think there's two questions or two things I want to pick out from your opening comment and question. So the first is about the ethical and the political. And the way you described ethics, I think, is an accurate description of what we've done to ethics, particularly in the last few hundred years in the Western philosophical tradition. But I actually don't think it's a good description of what ethics is. So I'm a virtue ethicist in part because when I read Aristotle, for all of the terrible things that Aristotle has said, for all of his completely boneheaded views about the rational capacities of women and non-Greeks and so forth. One thing Aristotle understood is that the ethical is political, and there was no sense in the mind of most sort of Greek philosophers that somehow ethics made sense as an individual practice separated from the political realm. Now, in part, that was because they associated the individual outside of the political realm with the domestic, which they devalued as a sphere of gendered responsibility and care and sort of intimate family life. And so when Plato and Aristotle are talking about ethics in the political realm, it's partly because they think that's where manly men use their intelligence doing manly political things. But they weren't wrong that the ethical is political. It's political at home as well, is what they missed, I think. But the point is that I've never been able to understand ethics as separable from the political. And I think to the extent that AI ethics has been in some context, not all, in some context depoliticized and or politically denatured, that has been, I think, a tremendous loss to what AI ethics is about. Fortunately, there are so many voices pushing back against that denaturing of AI ethics and depoliticization. So the fact that when we talk about justice, we cannot avoid talking about power. We cannot avoid talking about equality. We cannot avoid talking about the legitimate uses of power. We cannot avoid talking about violence and harm and oppression. And we cannot talk about justice also without talking about what is right, what is good, what is moral. So for me, the ethical and the political are not separate spheres, although we can discriminate in some ways the different features that we're highlighting when we talk about the ethical versus the political. So I think AI ethics needs to embrace the political, I suppose, is what I'm saying, but not in the sense of the partisan, in the sense of talk about the legitimate use of power and what the constraints upon that are, and what gives power legitimacy when it has legitimacy. With respect to the question of whether AI ethics is doing anything unique or special, I think it is. AI is not like a pencil in the following sense. I've never had to ask a question, why did the pencil do that? I don't think I'm ever going to have to ask the question, why did that pencil do that? Pencils do things that are not mysterious and not in any sense autonomous. And they have a relatively well-defined scope of purposes. So all artifacts are polypotent, meaning we can do more than one thing with them, right? So I can write with a pencil, but I can draw with a pencil. I can also stab with a pencil. But AI can be used in virtually every domain of human activity. And today, increasingly, we see that expansion into the realm of the creative arts, into finance, into health, into education. And I suppose in the sense that there could be pencils in all those domains too, sure, but the pencils are doing relevantly similar things, whereas AI is being used in wildly different applications. So I think I think we've now hit on two unique features of AI, not unique in the sense that nothing in the world has these features, just unique in the sense that they're providing a kind of step change in the ways that our artifacts act on our as extensions of our will. We still don't have AI systems that act on their own truly, right? They're still always extensions of human power and choice and decision making. But the agency between us and them has been stretched out to such a degree that often we lose a clear sense in some AI applications of how our will is being enacted by this system, by this machine, by this algorithm. It is still enacting our will, but in a way that has become opaque, in a way that has become not subject often to our immediate moment-to-moment control. And that also has this element of fluidity and malleability in terms of its applications, and also in the way that it can be interacted with by third parties. So the extent to which I use a pencil, unless someone's reaching over and grabbing my hand, I'm pretty much in control of what's happening with that pencil. But with AI systems, there are increasingly so many human agencies involved in their operations that it can be very difficult to assign responsibility to one particular agent. So we've started talking about the responsibility gap in AI that happens when it's difficult to take a particular AI action and find the human being singular or even a definite set of humans who's responsible.
Yeah, let me complicate the example a little bit. Let's say that instead of talking about a pencil, I mean, the pencil belongs to whoever devised the meme to begin with, and there's something snarky about it. But let's replace pencil with a more complicated artifact, perhaps just an ordinary plain old desktop computer. Of such an artifact, one could ask, why did it do that? Why did the computer do that rather than this? Why won't my software program accept this instruction? So on and so forth. So on the one hand, there's a question about the complexity of the artifact that we're dealing with. And what you've pointed out is that AI has attained a sufficient complexity that we can no longer just treat it as a passive implement that's something in the nature of a pencil or a tennis ball, something that we have complete control over and whose actions and effects in the world are determined entirely by our own uses of the technology. But so that already sets AI apart, but it doesn't yet quite set AI apart necessarily, it seems to me, as a self-standing discipline. So there's obviously such a thing as computer ethics, but it doesn't really mean the same thing as AI ethics. I suppose the question then is, are there questions that are proprietary to AI ethics? And by that I mean, are there questions whose answer is not already determined by, let's say, settled philosophical opinion? In the same way that we're more or less near consensus that certain things are just wrong to do. Obviously, murder, theft, rape, and so forth. These things are just wrong, and there's no argument about them. Is there anything that AI ethics poses as a question that cannot be answered simply by resorting to the uses that the technology is being put to? Do you think? I can volunteer my own opinion if
Sure.
you like.
Yeah.
So here I'm actually thinking, what got me thinking that there might be proprietary questions here is actually a paper that you wrote in 2015. And this is the paper, I've forgotten the full title, but it's about moral de-skilling. And this was very interesting to me because I came to something like the same general conclusions that you came to, but I came to it from a different angle. You came to it through virtue ethics, as you were describing. I came to it by considering human factors engineering. So there's this branch of industrial psychology, cognitive psychology, which studies how the tools that we use, generally autonomous systems, how they impact the psychology of the human users. I suppose it's a subset of human-computer interaction. And there are fairly profound effects and quite stubborn effects that technologies have on our propensities. And one of them is what's called automation bias or automation complacency, where you just sort of fall into an autopilot mode and you just trust the system is right. Another effect is that as you use your own technical and professional skills less and less, you rely on the system more and more, your skill set degrade or atrophy over time. And the result is obviously that you're no longer as good when push comes to shove and you're suddenly required to step up to the plate and meet the gap if the system fails. Now, I think you do mention this literature in your paper, but what struck me was that, well, if that's the case, if systems are having this effect on us, then what does that have to say about our moral faculties? We take it for granted that we can deliberate in moral situations, but is there an effect that's either adverse or perhaps even positive that these technologies will have on our ability to engage in moral deliberation? And that seems to me a genuinely novel question that can advance moral philosophy. Moral philosophy doesn't always consider this. To the extent it's considered in meta-ethics under the guise of moral psychology, but moral philosophy proper doesn't really consider this. And this is one example, and your paper stimulated me in that direction. So I'm just wondering whether you thought there was anything else that AI ethics can claim to be proprietary and can serve as a touchstone for making first order progress in moral and political philosophy.
So a couple things to say here. So first, I think, I don't know that I'm that invested in the answer to the question of whether AI ethics has anything proprietary, because I'm more interested in the question of why it's useful. So I'm more sort of pragmatic about it, in the sense that why is it useful to talk about AI ethics instead of computer ethics? Because I think there are sort of distinct kinds of practical challenges that haven't presented themselves in computer ethics in quite this form, that are associated with things like machine learning, and that are associated also with autonomous systems and autonomous agents, and robotics. So I think there's a sort of cluster of unique practical challenges. So you pointed out that in ethics we have this fairly strong consensus about the kinds of things we shouldn't do, murder and so forth, torture and whatnot, and we debate edge cases, right?
Yeah.
And we debate the definitions, but there's all this stuff in AI where we're not debating edge cases, we're debating sort of fundamental, how should this be deployed day to day? And in many cases, there's no consensus on what's appropriate. So we talk about things like sentiment analysis, or affect recognition. There's lots of different words for it. And there's this profound debate in AI ethics, whether this is even scientifically legitimate, whether this is not just sort of, three phrenologists in a trench coat, or if it is scientifically legitimate, even in a minimal or provisional way, is it ethically legitimate to deploy these technologies in certain contexts? This is not settled, right? And there are quite divergent views on this. So I think one way to talk about what's distinctive or necessary about AI ethics is because it's talking about things where we're not debating edge cases, we're debating primary uses and applications, and where technologies or techniques like machine learning and their advancements, for example, large language models and sort of transformers like GPT-3 are presenting some novel things that we really haven't had to wrestle with before. Doesn't mean there won't be parallels. It doesn't mean we're on some radically different planet of ethics. It just means that the work really is qualitatively distinct. So that's one thing. The second thing is with respect to what we learn from moral philosophy here. I think there are some really interesting meta-ethical questions that are implicated by AI. For example, what we mean by reasoning. So increasingly we talk about machine reasoning, and generally we think of this, or at least philosophers and who are AI ethicists tend to think of machine reasoning as an analogy with the word reason. We're not talking about real reason. But what it does is it kind of puts more pressure on us than was on before to talk about what is distinctive about human reasoning and what is missing in machine reasoning. And we've long in philosophy of mind gone down this sort of computational model of the mind track. And there's been lots of debate about the validity of that. But I think in meta-ethics also, we're challenged to re-examine what we mean by something like reason's responsiveness as a property of moral agents. So we talk about, moral philosophers talk about moral agents as having to be reasons responsive. And one of the reasons that my dog is not a moral agent is my dog is not reasons responsive in the same way, right? But what if I have an artificial agent? Now we're not at this point, and I don't know that we will be anytime soon, but assume we have an artificial agent that has, through advances in machine learning, developed a dialogical capacity to be reasons responsive within certain bounded areas. So we're not going to get to AGI or something like that, I think, anytime in my lifetime, if ever. But we might get to a system that is reasons responsive within a bounded task and domain. Is it a moral agent in that domain? And how do we answer that? And I think it might suggest that there's some under-specification in our notion of what it is to be reasons responsive. So I do think there are some interesting philosophical puzzles, and maybe some gaps in moral philosophy that will be illuminated by challenges from AI. In terms of our normative judgments, I think there's this other issue that you highlighted from my work about how AI can change us and change our own moral capacities. Now, again, this isn't something where I would insist that this is sort of a novelty of a radically pure sort. Our technologies have always changed us, and our technologies have always resulted in shifts, not just in our moral reasoning, but our political thinking, our scientific understanding of the world. We have co-evolved with the world we've built with our technologies. We build ourselves, our values, our expectations, our framings of reality into the built environment, and then they're reflected back into us, sometimes in surprising ways that cause further changes and so forth. So AI is in some sense just continuing this pattern where humans are co-shaped by, and our societies are co-shaped by the technologies that we build into the world. But I do think that the growing, and I mean this not in this sort of philosophical sense, but just in the mechanical sense, the growing agency of AI, the growing power of it to do things and change things in the world, and at scales and speeds and with the kind of complexity you mentioned that makes it hard for us to map our individual choices onto a discrete set of effects in the world that we can track. I think that's making it harder to know, in some sense, what the effects of this kind of technology are on us. And I think about the ways that AI is being used, for example, in the workplace, to monitor and predict and manipulate and judge and rank and nudge. It's often being used in multiple layers of application in the workforce. We've got not one sort of AI system changing us. We may have 10 different AI systems changing us, right? From the chatbots that we're interacting with, to the predictive analytics that are being used to feed us our stats in real time, to the facial recognition that we might be scanned with in order to get into our office. And I think we have no real way to understand the collective impact of this on our psyche, on our moral capabilities and skills, unless we start thinking about it and studying it really, really rigorously.
Yeah. What you said actually brought to mind two things. One, as far as technology having constantly had an effect on our moral sensibilities, I'm reminded of what Michel Foucault wrote in Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. He mentions how the methods of enforcement and the punishments that were used a long time ago were particularly vile and gruesome, quartering and hanging and all sorts of terrible things. And he connected that to the very primitive methods of detection, because if someone committed a crime, the chances of the state, such as it was at that point in history, finding that person was so slim. You had to enforce the law with a particular gruesome brutality. And so as our methods of detection became better, and it became increasingly likely that if you did the wrong thing, you'd be caught, then punishments gradually became less and less severe, because you didn't have to make such a terrible example of the criminal. it would be sufficient just to put them behind bars or something much more humane. So and obviously, I mean, we all think today, oh, how gruesome and primitive were those medieval people who they could form congregations and watch someone being tortured and have that as a kind of sport. We're so much different. We're actually not that different. Well, obviously genetically we're not all that different, but culturally we're very different. And this is really in no small part to the fact that technology has changed, and that's had this profound effect on our perceptions of ourselves and on each other. So that what you said reminded me of that point.
Can I just jump in and add one thing there?
Yeah.
You know, what's interesting that makes me think about is the fact that, and yet precisely because our measures of detection, and not just of crime, but of all kinds of behavior that someone in power disvalues, because of the growing power of surveillance, the occasions of punishment are so much more frequent. They're much more minor. We're right. I mean, of course, we could talk about the expansion in many countries like the United States of rates of incarceration and things like that. And certainly there is legitimate reason to worry, serious reason to worry that AI is going to drive an amplification of what is already a sort of not scandalous. There's a word I'm looking for, but unconscionable overuse of the carceral system in the United States and many other countries. So AI is driving that. But AI is also driving it, as I said, in the workplace. It's also driving it in the classroom. Think about Proprietary and the way it's been used during the pandemic to over-police students and as a way of promising to catch all possible cases of cheating on exams over Zoom, right?
Yeah.
So the punishments are less severe, but they're increasingly ubiquitous. And this is something I think we need to think about with AI.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. I was just going to finish that by saying all of the above, all of which is to affirm your point that technology really, the challenges that AI is posing are not of an entirely different order. They are somewhat continuous with those that have gone before. Whether we're dealing with a change in degree or something more radical is another question, although our foregoing considerations suggest that we're just dealing with a change perhaps of degree. But the other thing that came to mind as you were speaking is meta-ethics. I'm glad you mentioned meta-ethics, because obviously a lot of talk about AI ethics is quite, in terms of the sort of hierarchy of ethical concerns, it's quite at the bottom. We're still dealing with really basic ethical problems and concerns. But I was thinking about the fact that in computational linguistics and natural language processing, the very enterprise of trying to teach machines to pass human natural language can in itself, that very activity, shed light on the nature of language. So computational linguistics proceeds, and you would expect as a natural, I suppose, byproduct of that process that we learn more about the nature of language. I mean, there are skeptics, people in linguistics who would deny that emphatically, but I think as a general proposition, it's fairly plausible. And your discussion of meta-ethics and AI made me think, well, it's probably very similar. The very enterprise of teaching machines values that we care about, whatever paradigm you use, whether you're a utilitarian or a virtue ethicist or whatever, that very activity is probably going to shed light on the nature of morality. So there's another way in which AI ethics may advance first order moral philosophy, in the sense that we learn more about the nature of our ethical selves just in the task of teaching machines. We're running out of time. We've got about 5 minutes before we go to questions. So let me just bring another issue forward. In keeping with the theme of democracy and legitimacy and politics, there's this thing called the knowledge paradox, which is, on the one hand, all of us need to be much more informed about digital technology. We need digital literacy in order to grapple with it, in order to make informed decisions at the ballot box and so on. on the other hand, there's this other phenomenon, which is the more you know about the effects of the technology, the more particularly you know about how you are being surveilled, the more you end up becoming a slave of it, because you become nervous and anxious and fidgety. The eye of sort of big brother modifies your behavior. So this has been referred to as a knowledge paradox. On the one hand, knowledge is the means to emancipation, liberation, taking control. On the other hand, knowing more about this technology might end up having the perverse effect of making you even more limited and constrained in your everyday dealings in the world. I've got my own thoughts about whether this really is a paradox, but I wonder whether you have anything to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the reason that I don't think it's a paradox. I think the reason that it appears to be one is because the kind of knowledge that we obtain increasingly about what our socio-technical systems are doing to us and with us and through us is increasingly the kind of knowledge that we are powerless to act upon. So the reason that knowledge is liberating is because it enables action, right? But if those paths of action are closed to us by other forces, then knowledge is just another path to neurosis, right? Think about the way if we find out that we have a disease, but we have a risk of a high genetic risk of a disease, but we can do nothing to prevent it. All we can do is be on hyper alert for the symptoms of it, but there's nothing we could do, right? That's probably for most of us just going to make us neurotic and anxious and not in any way free. But knowledge of a condition that you can then prevent by changing your behavior is something else. So I think what we're looking at is a situation where the more we know about AI, the more anxious we become because of how little most citizens. And I also want to just say, I'm trying not to use the word citizen, and maybe I wanted to ask you this about why the book is called The Citizen's Guide, and is there a way of thinking of citizen really much more broadly? Because we're not all citizens of the places that we live and where we're affected, right? So I'll just sort of flag that maybe you want to say something about it. But as a non-citizen of the UK, I'm particularly acutely aware of this because I'm nonetheless subject to the laws of the UK. But I want to say that the fact that we can do so little as citizens or residents or subjects of these technologies to change how they act upon us and how they affect our relationships and our opportunities and our chances for human flourishing is why I think the knowledge paradox appears. So the solution is to open up again the paths of action, and that unfortunately has to happen through a form of political resistance, because there are very powerful vested interests that would much prefer those paths to remain closed.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that limitation of the use of the word citizen. It actually hadn't occurred to me that many people are not citizens. I myself am not a citizen of the UK, although perhaps in my case, the reason why it didn't enforce itself as strongly is because I, as a citizen of a Commonwealth country, I do have rights to vote in the UK. So maybe that's why it didn't really click. But yes, if you're in another country, you're not a citizen. So in that sense, the word has to be read much more inclusively here to mean anybody that is subject to the laws of a body politic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so we're at 22. So this might be a good time to go to Q&A. So let me see, there's a few questions here. So one question here is, we already have a whole kind of framework in ethics, moral philosophy. Then why don't we go with keeping in mind those do's and don'ts? Sorry, let me just make sure I'm getting this right. So I think the questioner is essentially asking, the existing framework that we have in ethics, I take it they mean something like the standard ethics that everybody would sign up to. Most people, let's say in the liberal democratic West, would sign up to. why don't we keep that ethical framework in mind when we, as a way of avoiding a lot of problems in the field of AI? Not quite sure how to answer that, but yeah.
Maybe one thing I can say is that the questioner references do's and don'ts, and this is something I talked about a little bit in my book in 2016. That when we're talking about new technologies that haven't yet revealed their effects, we don't have the do's and don'ts. So when you ask a question, is it wrong to use Facebook? And especially when you asked that question, 5-10 years ago, that isn't a question that made a whole lot of sense at that time. Because no one really understood at first what Facebook would become, what it would do. It was, the possibilities were open enough that really what we were asking were much more fine-grained questions about what are beneficial ways to engage with Facebook, and what are some of the risks of Facebook. But Facebooking isn't a category that is well defined like murder, where you can put it onto a list of do's and don'ts. I do think, of course, I'm going to separate that now from the issue of whether people should be boycotting Facebook at this point because of the failures of the company, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about back when there were early debates about social media and people were making decisions about whether they wanted to be on social media or not. It wouldn't have made sense to sort of list social media activity as a do or a don't. It was a much more fine-grained, nuanced kind of question. The same thing is true about social robots. Are social robots right or wrong? To me, that question doesn't make sense. Tell me what this robot is. Tell me what it does. Tell me where it is. Tell me how it's designed. And then I can say some things drawing upon ethical frameworks, yes. Drawing upon, for example, Kantian notions of autonomy. Is this robot deceiving people? Is it using them through the agency of the human robot designer or corporation behind the robot? Is the robot using people as a mere means to an end? Well, okay, if it is, then I think we can actually use those traditional moral frameworks to understand why this deception or manipulation is wrong. But I think the point is that these kind of blunt do's and don'ts don't really apply in a lot of these cases.
And I take it you're also referring to the do's and don'ts in ethical frameworks and guidelines, the sort of high-level abstract statements of good value, good intentions that don't really amount to much because they're too ambiguous to be actioned.
That's right. So if you have principles of make sure that your AI is safe and transparent and fair, great. Now tell me what that means in practice with this particular system. That is a much harder problem.
And that means, so therefore it's not surprising that a company, somewhat notorious, Compass, the criminal recidivism tool, could be defended as fair by both those that were in its favor and those that were detractors. They both claimed that the tool was, well, one claimed that it was fair, one claimed that it was unfair. Both would suggest that they were adhering to this ambiguous principle, high-level principle. And so that's a nice example.
And actually, that's another example of how AI has revealed more about our moral and political frameworks and some of the gaps and ambiguities in them, because it helped more people see that actually fairness has multiple incompatible definitions in the way that we understand it. And that's why people have started to shift to talking about justice, for example, as something that might help us settle some of the disputes about fairness. Well, there's, this kind of there's sort of demographic parity here in this system. Is that fair? Well, there's, a different model of fairness here. Well, which is more just is one way of settling that argument. So I think it is an example of how we can learn more about moral and political experience and understanding from seeing these challenges that come from AI.
We'll go to quite a simple question. A straightforward question here is, what's an example of everyday AI besides Siri and Alexa?
The most classic answer is the AI that filters spam out of your email inbox. You don't see it, you don't interact with it, but if you have one of the large commercial email platforms, you're almost certainly benefiting from it every day. I've been amazed, actually, just over the past 10 years to see the difference between what shows up in my inbox today as opposed to 10 years ago, when it was a constant battle to clear the garbage out every day that would leak in.
Right. Yeah. And obviously there are many other examples that we could give. Amazon and Netflix recommendation systems, Google Maps.
Every ad you see online.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And actually this brings us to, underscores another point, which is the very invisibility of most of what actually really is AI. The invisibility of it, the fact that it is just a part of the world we now inhabit, makes it appear innocuous, but actually it's that invisibility that disguises the true power that it potentially has over us. So it looks innocuous, and obviously we find it very helpful and it assists us in our navigating the world. But what did it take for these systems to become as useful as they are? Obviously, we were complicit in creating them by giving our data away to the companies, who then harvested that data and trained the systems that now make life easier for us. So actually, what I like about that question is that it points out just how much of the furniture it is.
Yeah. Well, two other things just to mention very quickly. One is it also shows how much the public and popular media rhetoric around AI has led people to think that AI is about having a agent, a persona, right, embedded in a system. Whereas even if they understand what the algorithm filtering their Netflix recommendations is doing, they're not likely to think of it as AI, because there's nobody there, right? It's just an algorithm sorting and filtering and recommending and predicting. But the thing is that when we talk about AI, that's almost entirely what we mean in the real world today. That's all there is,
that's
right?
There is. Yeah.
And Alexa is doing much of the same thing. It's just they've built an interface on top of it that makes it seem like there's a digital person there, right? But that's really an illusion built on the same kind of technology that's running your Netflix recommendations and your ad serving and all these other things. It's really just machine learning that we're talking about, machine learning algorithms. So if I often think it would be better if we had not used the word AI to talk about these kinds of algorithms, and reserved AI for something that had some sort of artificial agency of a more robust sort. But that ship has sailed.
Yeah, that ship has sailed. Yeah. Perhaps we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Another question here concerns the nature of trust. In what ways do you think that trust between humans is different from trust between AI and humans?
So I don't think there can be trust between AI and humans in the real sense. I think there can be reliance. I think we use the word trust, but I think what we mean is we rely on AI systems, or we, in some cases, can, in some cases can't, or shouldn't. But we can and should, in some cases, rely on AI to do certain kinds of tasks, and we can and should trust the developers and deployers of AI, in some cases, to be responsible. But I think we should try as much as possible to hold that distinction between reliance on an artifact and trust in a person or an organization or an agency. And the reason why that distinction matters is because trust involves putting something in someone else's care, something that's important to you, something of value, whether it's your body, whether it's your thoughts, whether it's your money. You are putting something that matters to you, that's important to you, in the care of another. The problem is a machine can't care. None of the machines we have today can care. And they can't care for the things that you put in their power. Therefore, they cannot be objects of legitimate trust. If there is a person behind that machine that is using the machine to care for the thing, hold in trust the thing that you have entrusted, then we can talk about trust, where the trust is really passing through the machine to the agent that's responsible for it. But I get really worried, and I work on a project that's about trustworthy AI. So I think we can use that term as long as what we mean by the AI includes the people behind it.
Right. Actually, this is consistent with the social psychological literature that says that one of the components of trust, apart from reliability and accuracy, is an affective component. Actually, they refer to it as warmth. So there is this affective component, warmth, that you feel towards another human being, a conspecific, that entitles us to use the word trust there in a way that we are not entitled when we're just dealing with artifacts. I suppose someone might push back though and say, so for instance, every time I get on, let's start with an aircraft, every time I board a plane, I obviously, you could say, trust that I will get from where I am to my destination safely. And people might say, I trust the technology works, but by your lights, by what you've said, really what they mean is they trust the processes around what authorized that plane to be allowed to take off, all of the checks, all of the Boeing stress testing and so forth. And there's enough experience of it working that then we can say, yes, I trust the entire socio-technical system, which is not separate from the humans that are in the cockpit.
Just think about the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. When the second plane went down and people started to realize that this wasn't just a one-off, right? But that there was a sort of fundamental problem with these planes. When that started to become clear, right? People didn't feel betrayed by the plane.
Yeah.
They felt betrayed by Boeing. They felt betrayed by the regulators. They felt betrayed by whoever manufactured faulty sensors, right? It was, so I think the trust always comes with the possibility of being betrayed, or being disappointed. But only really a person can betray you, or an organization, or can betray you or disappoint you, because there's that affective dimension that you mentioned, where I have given in trust something because of this affective warmth, and now I feel anger because that has been dismissed, disregarded. And my act of trust has been not treated with the value that it warrants in human relations. None of that makes sense when we're talking about a machine. But as you say, because machines increasingly represent agents, it's going to get harder and harder to keep this clear. And I do worry about that.
So that's where I was going with the possible devil's advocate objection. So moving on from the plane example, where it's fairly clear that even though the language of trust might slip in to the ordinary passenger, what they're really meaning is the entire socio-technical system. But let's scale it up, and now let's talk about robots. So the extant social psychology literature on how humans interact with robots is markedly interesting and different from how humans interact with what we call embedded AI. So embedded AI like Alexa, Siri, Amazon recommendations, and so forth. When it comes to robots, a lot of the findings in what I mentioned earlier was human factors, where you overtrust the system and all of that, that seems not to hold. Doesn't generalize to the case of robots. With robots, we tend to anthropomorphize a whole lot more. And the trust, including the affective component, seems to be more prominent in our interactions with robots. And so this is the worry, that as robots themselves become better dissimulators or emulators of human conduct, we might start thinking that it cares for us because it's saying all the right things. When in fact, it's just a machine, it's dead on the inside, it's a zombie, the lights aren't on. So this is a danger, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's one that a lot of people worry about. And I think, it's interesting if you look at some of the studies, on social robotics, people were initially worried about this, deceiving children, deceiving the elderly, and so forth. But then there were all these anecdotal reports of engineers themselves reporting that they found themselves talking to their robot, or leaving the lights on around it so that it didn't have to sit in the dark, or things like. And these were people who built the thing; they knew it was dead inside, right? So it's not deception in the traditional sense. It's just the activation of a certain kind of affective desire that we project onto all kinds of objects,
right?
And it's not intrinsically wrong. I think the problem is the potential for it to be exploited, and the fact that these robots are being deployed in ways and without the kind of regulatory protections that can protect us from having those emotional responses exploited.
Yeah. I mean, is it really so surprising that humans, anatomically and genetically identical to ourselves, not too long ago, indeed even today, view rocks as having some sort of interior life? Would it be so surprising that a robot that acts the right way and says the right things would also elicit the same sort of reaction? Okay, so we can obviously talk a long time here, and I haven't even gotten through a third of the questions, but we are out of time. So I'm going to hand back over to Anthony and he can wrap up. But Shannon, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I couldn't have asked for a more prestigious and eminent person to discuss this book with. So I'm really appreciative of your giving your time today for this.
Well, congratulations on the book. And it's really a very clear and compelling and vivid read, and strongly recommend it. So I hope people will get out and find it.